People are missing. I saw what they won't find. Those words aren't clickbait for me. They're a confession I should have made 7 years ago, and didn't. Because every time I started to speak about that night, my throat tightened like a noose. Now the news is playing the same footage again. Choppers circling the ridge, an anchor reading bullet points with a practiced softness, hikers' faces blown up on the screen with the words, "Missing, please help." Hashtags scroll under the broadcast like a second cruel ticker tape. Had find them. Hash Woods mystery. Or stay safe. Volunteers line up at the trailhead, thermals and headlamps jangling, and I watch from my kitchen window like a ghost at a wake. I've kept this quiet for years. I told myself silence was protection, that by not naming it, I could keep other people out of those trees. But tonight, with rescue teams combing the exact same drainage and a dozen more people vanishing from the map, I can't afford silence anymore. I need to say it flatly so someone, anyone, can hear. I was there. I know what wrong way of the wind out there sounds like. I know what follows. We called ourselves the Dare Club because Urban Exploration Group sounded too clinical, and Dare Club earned us cheap shirts and a few reckless Instagram posts. We were kids who liked Rust and Echo. 3 abandoned warehouses, a condemned hospital wing, a neon sign that still flickered in a rainstorm. Matthew was the one who dared the most. He'd wedge his boots into rotted stairwells and shout through the broken panes until his voice came back to him from every corner, grinning like he'd swallowed a secret. I was quieter. I filmed, took notes, cataloged cracks, and laughed when it felt safe. That summer, we decided to sleep in the woods by the old processing mill on the outskirts, city lights a smudge to the south, the mill a silhouette that breathed steam at dusk. It was half urban exploration and half dare. Spend the night, set up a fire, document the animals, or the lack of them. We named the trek, "I Dare You to Go Camping After Listening to This," as a joke for the video title. I should have known how the joke would age. Flashbacks come in short bursts. I remember the smell first. Wet leaves and match smoke, the sickly sweet rot of something old and hungry. I remember Matthew's laugh when he pried open a tin of beans with too much drama. I remember the flashlight beam catching something that shouldn't have been there. A patch of hairless skin, pale and taut over a shoulder, then gone when the light swung. I remember someone saying offhand, "That wasn't a deer," and the sentence cutting through the night like a shard. "That wasn't a deer," Ben said. He wasn't saying "be quiet" or "did you hear that?" He was saying proof, eyes narrowing, breath condensing in white puffs. We all turned toward the sound, because even whispers pull you like strings when you're alone in the dark. The noise came again, not a bleat, not the hollow clack of a branch. It was a mimic of a footstep, a pause, and then, impossibly, the sound of boots moving over dry leaves, a cadence Matthew used when he was trying to be dramatic. I thought it was Matthew at first. He loved to play with us. He loved to toy with the dark. He loved asking horrible, delicious questions and making us answer. He answered back that night in a way he never could have, a voice from the woods that sounded like him, calling his name with the wrong spelling of breath. It called and then copied the ping of our headlamp clicks, the low hum of someone's recorder, the exact rhythm of our laughter, until we weren't sure Which was imitation, and which was the real thing? We did all the things you're supposed to do when you're scared, but not wise. We joked it away. We went looking. We split up because someone thought it would be clever, and because Matthew's grin had promised no harm. My memory turns jagged here, a hand on my shoulder, then the flare of a lighter. The world shrank to the sound of leaves underfoot and the single obscene clarity of that voice right behind me, calling out, "Matthew?" in a tone that wasn't Matthew but knew him so well it made my stomach lurch. I found his boot at the edge of the stream later. No one ever found the rest of him. They found some things. A jacket snagged by a root, a smear of red on the moss that could have been a berry, the frayed strap of his pack. Not Matthew, not the laugh he'd promised to give the world, not his face that used to be book-like with jokes. Afterward, I read reports in the paper about rare predators, about human error, about bears and misadventure. The police called it a tragedy that couldn't be solved. Some of the guys said Matthew ran off. Others stopped talking to me altogether. I started sleeping in the bathtub because I liked the way the tiles framed my body, like a photograph. I learned to flinch at the wrong noises. I am telling you all of this now because the same helicopters that hover over the ridge hovered over us back then, and the voices on the news are tired and familiar. Because tonight a drone footage clip showed something moving at the tree line with a gait that wasn't human and not quite animal. Because someone out there is excellent at sounding like the people they want to lure. Because if you go into those woods thinking you know what you're listening for, you might already be wrong. The Dare Club was stupid and brave and alive. We were going to be immortal in pixels and bravado. We were an urban exploration group on one stupid, perfect night that turned into a missing persons report. If my silence led to just one set of boots finding its owner, I would have kept it. But people are still going into those trees. People are still missing. I can't hold it in anymore. So this is me. Talking, remembering, failing to be clean about it. The rest of the story, what we saw, and what it learned to say, comes next. It starts with the night, with Matthew's laugh, with a sound that copied him better than any of us could. It starts with a dare. 7 years earlier, we packed into Gabe's old hatchback like we still believed in cheap rights. The road was a ribbon of late summer heat, and the playlist Gabe swore was curated for cliffhangers. Equal parts punk shrieks, guilty pop sing-alongs, and one too many synth tracks. Matthew humored. Snack wrappers rustled like applause. A bag of chili lime chips vanished within the first 10 minutes, and Terry kept producing cookies from a coat pocket as if he had a secret concession stand. The windows were cracked for cigarette smoke that only Gabe and I dared to inhale, and the dashboard smelled faintly of spilled soda and rubber. Someone started a chant of our old dares, and the car replied with laughter so loud it blurred the scenery. We had roles even on that ride. Gabe was the announcer, talking into his phone like the camera was always 3 seconds away, inventing backstories for the places we passed. Christian was the engineer of doubt, correcting distances and probabilities, and rolling his eyes the way he did when the group needed a tether to reality. Terry was the human helium balloon, inflating any silence with a joke. Matthew was the quiet one who chuckled at the right moments, whose laugh made the back seat feel warmer. I was the one with the camera between my knees, shooting snapshots of elbows and knees and the way late sunlight carved our faces, promising myself I would catch us before we smudged. When Gabe announced the destination, government land past Black Hollow, there's an old research facility allegedly abandoned. The car filled with the polite illness of something too small to be called a lie. Allegedly abandoned became our dare's legalese. Christian, slicing a bruised apple, didn't look up. Gabe, abandoned research facility, is the kind of thing people write about when they want to sound like a weekend horror podcast. Where's the evidence? His voice was amused but flat. Doubt was his comfortable shape. Gabe grinned like he'd been dared to grin. We have satellite images, dude. There's concrete, maybe some rust, maybe a ghost with a clipboard. Imagine the content. He mimed turning a camera, and we all laughed because it was exactly the kind of thing we would do. Collect pixels of defiance and upload them for proof of bravado. Christian's skepticism didn't kill the idea, it sharpened it. Fine. If there's an actual do not enter sign, we'll turn around. If someone is actually chained to a clipboard, you owe me $10. Deal, Terry said, tossing a cookie at him that hit Christian's forehead and softened the bargain. By the time we found the pull-off, the sun had become a sliver. We set up camp with the practiced efficiency of people who'd pooled tents a dozen times and never quite learned how to pitch them properly. Tents leaned like tentative houses. Gabe cleared a circle for a fire, scraping autumn's skeptical earth with a pocket knife while Matthew collected kindling with the same economy of motion he used in conversation. Unobtrusive, necessary. I fumbled with my camera, trying different lenses, worrying about ISO like I could coax light into staying. Terry, flinging a sleeping bag over a log, pointed out the fence line with the solemnity of a tour guide. Look at that, barbed wire, newish post, somebody cares. He extended the joke like a flag. Goatman territory, he said, deadpan, and then lost it, laughing so hard he snorted. The rest of us laughed because it was safer than looking at the sign nailed to the fence. Restricted, no trespassing, government property. The woods beyond the fence looked like a mouth, dark, lined with teeth of alder and pine. Matthew walked to the edge and stood looking in. Not a throwaway glance, but a sustained study, like a man reading a paragraph he couldn't quite finish. He didn't make a joke, didn't take a picture. He just watched. The way his shoulders settled suggested he wasn't calculating a route. He was listening. I kept raising my camera, fingers cold and clumsy, trying to keep them from shaking. Flash popped on the first frame, too bright, and flattened faces into paper plates. I took another, dialing down the exposure until my screen glowed with the soft grain of dusk. Every shot felt like trying to hold breath underwater. Something essential slipping away when you opened your mouth. As the sun sank, the air changed. Heat folded into a cleaner, sharper cold. Birds that had been loud a half hour ago fell silent, as if someone had muted them. The fire started, small, obedient, and our voices thinned into the kind of conversation that happens when the world narrows to a camp circle and the things outside are no longer background noise. Terry kept telling improvised lore about the area. Christian countered with zoning statutes and maps. Gabe kept making notes into his phone about angles and light. Matthew, who had been watching the tree line, finally spoke with a voice that was only for us. "Do you hear that?" he said. We listened. For a moment there was only the hiss of the fire and the distant domestic drone of a road. But as sunlight became a rumor on the leaves, a new small sound threaded into the air. Something like a footstep across dry brush, but irregular, as if it were trying not to be noticed. The circle tightened without command. We all turned toward the trees and the silhouette where the woods met the fence, and for the first time that night, the laughter thinned into something else. We turned back to the circle as if a cue had been given. The fire threw their faces into small, trembling maps. Terry's cheekbones a bright ridge, Christian's jaw a shadowed plane, Gabe's knuckles pale where he rubbed them, Matthew's eyes caught like coins. Terry leaned forward, palms near the heat, and dropped his voice to that stage whisper he'd practiced in basements and barbecues. The showman was back. "You know how legends start," he said, teeth flashing when the firelight struck him, "with something someone couldn't explain. But what if it wasn't about explaining? What if it was about listening?" Christian snorted. "Or someone heard a raccoon and then started selling T-shirts." Terry ignored him. "They say it mimics, not just voices. It copies the way you move, the way you hold your head. You blink, it blinks. You call for your dog, it answers with your dog's bark, except wrong, like a cassette with the tape stretched." "That's not how animal vocal cords work," Christian cut in. "Raccoons and owls make noises and parrots repeat syllables. There's physics behind sound." "And what about the smell?" Gabe asked, voice low. He'd been scrolling through old articles and his phone screen reflected a thin line of blue on his chin. "They say it can smell familiarity. It'll walk through a house, and it smells like the last thing you cooked. Smells of bacon, of laundry detergent, even of the person it wants you to follow." Terry's hands painted the account in little, urgent gestures. "It learns. It collects pieces. You think you're following a memory, but it's leading you." Christian waved a hand. "Okay, so now this thing has a scent library and a PhD in human behavior. Next you'll tell me it has opposable thumbs." "Not opposable," Terry said, smiling. "Adaptable. It can press a doorknob if someone left the latch loose. It positions itself where people expect shelter. Old porches, abandoned cars, basements full of boxes." "You mean it hides where people hide?" Christian said. He was more amused than convinced. "Animals take shelter too. Abandoned structures are warm and dry. That doesn't make it supernatural." Gabe's phone lit his face. "There are old reports, though. In '98, a kid from the west side went missing near the power lines. Found his bike, not him. They said he wandered off after thinking he heard his sister calling. The sister was deaf and lived in the next town. Nobody could explain why he called back." Matthew's hands had gone still. "Do you remember the playground story? The swings were still moving. Alone." His voice was small, like someone had just left. Terry leaned in, eyes hungry in the firelight. "Mimicry isn't just sound. It copies posture, the catch in your breath. People get the sensation of being observed, like someone is learning them, cataloging a favorite phrase. And once it's learned, it uses that piece to pull you away." A thin crack answered him from the dark. a pine cone snapping underfoot, sharp and dry. All of us turned. The sound was small and ordinary, a twig giving under some animal's weight. Matthew's shoulders rose. He whispered, "That's it, that's—" "Raccoon," Christian said before Matthew could finish. "Or a deer. Wood is full of dry stuff. It's a pine cone, guys. Nature making noise." We let the explanation settle like dust. The circle loosened. Terry didn't push. He wasn't stupid. He let the silence hold the story for a beat, longer than necessary. And in that time the fire popped, and a smell of resin rose. Gabe kept scrolling, thumb moving mechanically. There was also a house fire out by Hollow Road. Family moved out in the middle of the night because they heard the baby crying by the woods. They left everything. The baby was never found. People say they heard it calling after, like something wanted company. "It's tragic," Christian said, softer now. "People attribute pattern to trauma. It's easier to place blame on a thing than on a mistake." Terry's smile thinned. "Maybe. Or maybe sometimes the thing is real." The woods offered nothing else. For a while we spoke about exit routes and headlights and the stupid jokes of strangers who think courage is loud. Eventually quietness became a thing to maintain. We extinguished the hope of long conversation and readied for sleep. Flashlights clicked off. Bags were zipped open, and hands moved in practiced motions. An owl cut the dark, but it wasn't the familiar cyclical who. It was bent, a rubbered echo, the pitch sliding and then snapping like a radio spun between stations. The sound made the hair on Matthew's neck stand up. "That's not," he started. "Barred owl," Christian said immediately, as if repeating the name would fix it. "They call all sorts of ways." Tent flaps rustled as we crawled inside. The zipper on Terry's tent made a final, decisive sound. One by one, zippers closed. Gabe's, Christian's, Matthew's, and at last, mine. The fire hummed lower. The owl's call quivered again, pulled towards something not quite human, and the night kept listening. I woke to the sound of canvas, whispering and something softer, like a pile of dry leaves, being rummaged through. For a second my mind gave me a dream and a half-remembered punchline. Then Terry's voice, hoarse and close, cut it clean. "You guys hear that?" Hands moved in the dark, tentative and clumsy. Flashlights clicked on like nervous beetles. Their beams sliced the night, thin white knives that trembled as they swept across tents and the black teeth of trunks. The light hit the cooler first, one of our cheap plastic ones by the fire, revealing a jagged row of gouges along its lid. Deep claw grooves, not the neat scrapes of a branch, but spaced and brutal, like someone had raked a file across the plastic. The flashlight made the scratches glint, and for a moment none of us spoke, because light had turned possibility into evidence. "Probably raccoons," Christian said immediately, his voice steadier than he felt. He leaned on the rationale like a railing. "They'll get into anything. I've seen worse in the city alleys." "Raccoons don't make grooves like that," Matthew said. His breath fogged in front of him, and then disappeared. The owl called again, an off-key, bending note, and it made Matthew's voice sharper. "Raccoons bite. They don't tear like that." We moved as a unit, boots soft on pine needles. The flashlight beams overlapped, then separated, searching. The smell of the fire and resin was still there, but colder now, edged with something metallic and damp that made my teeth ache. At the back of the camp I found the other cooler, and the light stayed on the same pattern, long, deep gouges traveling along the seam where lid met body. The grooves were smeared with something dark and tacky that reflected our lights like wet paint. Christian laughed once, too bright. "Okay, heavy raccoon, maybe a raccoon that pumps iron." He tried to make a joke of it. The joke didn't land. Terry stayed silent, eyes fixed on the marks. And then Gabe's beam landed on the tripod. He cursed under his breath. Camera equipment lay scattered between the coolers like flotsam after a storm. Straps chewed through, the hard case ruptured, foam padding ripped to shreds. One of our cameras was crushed, the lens housing bitten down and warped, glass spiderwebbed. There were puncture marks in the rubber and small crescent-shaped teeth impressions in the aluminum. Close up, the bite marks weren't the sloppy gnawing of a small animal. They were deliberate, crushing. "That isn't raccoon," I said, because saying it made the sound of it less slippery. Christian knelt, flashlight tucked under his chin to see, and for the first time his explanation cut out at the edges. "Raccoons do put their hands on stuff," he said finally, picking at a torn strap. "But, I don't know. Diseased dog? Fox? Could be an opossum." Gabe turned the ruined camera over, his breath loud in the circling light. "We had it recording for the urban ruins, man. The night footage. Gone." He lifted a memory card, clutched it like a talisman. The card was clean, but the case it came in had 2 clean punctures. "Bite marks," he whispered. Condensation fringed the inside of our tents now, beads forming on the canvas in ghostly rows. My own breath pooled on the flap as a faint, sticky fog rolled close to the ground and gathered like a visiting thing, with no respect for property lines. The air between us tasted of cold iron and cedar. We stood there for another long minute, listening. The rustling had stopped. Somewhere farther off, a small animal scolded the night. It sounded ordinary and wrong in the context of our unease. The group made a calculation in silence, fear balanced against exhaustion, curiosity against the cold. The rational voices picked back up, plans for better locks on coolers, stacking gear inside tents, rerouting tripods around the blaze of the campfire. Terry didn't push. He let us remold the night into something manageable. We gathered the salvageable pieces and stuffed the ruined kit under the tarp. Someone draped extra jackets over straps to hide bright plastic. One by one the flashlights went off, the beams snapping away until only the fire breathed weak and orange. Inside the tents, the condensation trembled on the walls like cold breath. My hand left a wet print when I smoothed the fabric down. As we crawled back into our sleeping bags, the fog moved in proper then, a low, wet swell that rolled between trees and swallowed the path back to our car. Its edges slid along the ground and licked the firelight into dull halos. We zipped up, told ourselves we would check the equipment in the morning, and pretended to sleep with the kind of practiced, shallow breaths that keep panic from spilling. The night listened, and when it answered, it was only a soft, patient sigh of mist against canvas. Morning light found the campsite in a mean, unforgiving way, slanting through the pines and painting everything in hard outlines. The flap of my tent hung open like a jaw, and where the canvas had been stretched tight overnight, the morning revealed a new kind of violence. Deeper claw marks gouged down the zipper line, ragged and almost deliberate, splinters of canvas caught in the teeth of the tears. The soot from last night's fire had settled into the rips and glinted like exhausted stars. Condensation still trembled on the inner walls, but the fog had retreated enough to let us see the tracks. There were prints in the soft loam beyond the tarp, a string of odd, looping impressions that made me think of pause, and not quite pause, at once. Christian squatted, the camera slung from his neck, and peered close through the viewfinder. He clicked more photos than necessary, breath fogging the lens as he leaned forward. Macro, wide, scale, he muttered, snapping like a machine. He pressed the screen to show us. An impression with a crescent of claw gouges, the negative space between toes deeper than a dog, the pad smeared with something dark and wet that still smelled faintly of fur. Terry tried for a laugh. Maybe it was just a really big raccoon with performance anxiety, he said, voice thin. He wiggled his fingers as if that could unbend the tension in his shoulders. His joke landed in the wet air and stayed there, awkward and small. Or a mime who ate a bear, he added, then laughed too loud. He kept making jokes the way you hum a tune to keep from hearing your own heart. Matthew stood a little apart, hands deep in his jacket pockets, eyes on the prints, but not meeting ours. He had the 2 punctures in his forearm where we'd found him at the edge of the tree line the night before, and the skin around them was a pale road map. He didn't say much. He measured the marks with a finger, and then, with our little tape measure, mouth compressed. 9.5 centimeters across the pad, he said finally, voice flat. Claw marks about 2 inches apart. Those gouges are deep enough to catch a boot sole. Christian zoomed in on the dark smear and shot a close-up. Wet fur, he said, more to himself than to anyone. He inhaled, then squinted like a scientist sniffing a mystery. The smell hit me too, like a damp animal left out in an evening of rain, metallic at the edges, oddly chemical underneath. It made my scalp prickle. Gabe walked the perimeter with a steady, slow attention that felt like a hand on a spine. He stooped to examine a set of deeper claw marks along the aluminum siding of an abandoned generator shed. Parallel slashes, vicious and repeated. He ran his gloved thumb along one of the grooves, then looked up at us with a face that didn't try to hide the worry. "We don't split up," he said, quiet and firm. "Not to get supplies, not to check the car. We stay together, and we stick to a plan." We argued the usual things. Leave now before whatever it was comes back and try to get to the highway while it's light. Or hole up, fortify, and wait until dark passes and hope it moves on. Christian suggested driving to the town office to call someone more official, but the mud on the road and the rumor of a locked gate at the facility made the route uncertain. Terry kept cracking jokes. "Hey, maybe it wants us to sign a guest book." And then would go cold for a beat, anxiety peering out from the punchline. Cause and effect hung obvious as a weather vane. The prints led to the shed. The shed led to the weird chemical fur smell. The smell led us to the path that angled toward the research facility we had come to gawk at. Gabe folded his arms and set his feet. "We don't run like chickens," he said. "We don't split. We secure what we can, get some food in us, then we go together and check the facility. If there are answers, we get them there. If there are dangers, we face them together." Christian kept taking photos even as he nodded. Terry swore under his breath and then made another joke, softer, edged with real fear. "Lunch sounds great. I vote sandwiches and bullets." Matthew made no joke at all. He simply exhaled and tugged his jacket tighter around his arm, where the punctures had scabbed. After a few more measured breaths and one final sweep of the tracks, consensus settled like sediment. We would not leave in panic. We would not split. We packed the ruined gear, battened the tents, and agreed on rendezvous points through the radio. We would eat, regroup, and then, after lunch, we would walk to the research facility together. We had split into a loose grid among the skeleton of the research facility, picking our paths between buckled walkways and slabs of crumbling concrete that tasted like dust and old rain. Rebar jutted like broken ribs from collapsed walls, and every step sent a tiny avalanche of gravel sliding down into shadowed hollows. I was 5 paces from the rust-stained archive door when I heard him, Gabe's voice, clear, close, pulling at my name from the wrong direction. "Gabe," I called reflexively, voice bouncing off the hollow atrium. The reply came back faster than it should have. Right behind me, the syllables folded around the same consonants, but the cadence wrong. As if someone had traced Gabe's mouth with a pencil and got the outline, but not the pressure. Then another one answered from further left, from the overgrown perimeter where the trees had taken back the parking lot, and another from the shattered skylight above, each Gabe stacking, like plates crashing into the same sink. Echoing footsteps hammered around us, Christian's boots on metal, Terry's lighter tread on loose concrete, Matthew's quiet shuffle, except when they didn't. Sometimes the steps matched the voices, sometimes there was only a voice and no boot fall where my brain expected it. The air smelled of the same chemical fur we had found at the shed, sweet and wrong, like a sweater sewed with pond water. The radios crackled with chatter we didn't understand, then, with our own names called back to us in loops, my skin crawled along the nape of my neck. "Is that you, Gabe?" Christian shouted, lens angled toward the tree line as if a camera could prove solidity. "Over here," a voice answered, close and friendly, and wrong, in the way of a trick. 2 voices answered at once from opposite sides. I could hear Gabe laughing in one, a long rolling sound he kept for when he was annoying us, and a softer, clipped version from the trees that sounded like someone trying to remember his laugh from a lunchroom photograph. Terry's joke fell out of him like breath, then hardened. He took a step back, the grin gone. "That doesn't sound—" His gaze cut to the shadowed copses, to the place where the underbrush made antlers from branches and where the light broke into skinny blades. "That's not Gabe!" Terry barked, loud and sudden enough to push the echo out of rhythm. His voice slammed into the wrong-sided chorus, and for a heartbeat we all froze. Radio beeps, skittering like insects. Panic came like a dropped stone. We called names. Fingers flew to belts. Feet found the planned rendezvous route on instinct. Radios that had been calm a minute ago spat static. The supposed echo of Gabe's stuttered, elongated, then multiplied into a chorus that held all the right syllables but nothing of the man we knew. Something moved in the tree cover, a thin announced snapping of twig and then a flash. Antler shadows crossing the broken concrete in a pattern that didn't match any deer we'd seen in town. For an instant the branches stamped black antlers against the light like a slideshow. Geometry, sharp and wrong. And beneath their rhythm, the dozen overlapping voices hummed at once, perfectly mimicking, perfectly off, as if someone had rehearsed the exact pitch of our lives and was now rearranging them. We ran before we could decide. The undergrowth closed in, thinning light scraping our shoulders as if trying to follow. Brambles slapped at sleeves. The scent of wet earth and old cigarette ash filled my nose. Every step was a negotiation. Roots, shards of glass, the slap of canvas from abandoned packs catching on twigs. We shoulder-checked through the brush like swimmers cutting a chop, turning our heads in half-second checks because any sound could be the mimic throwing our voices back at us. "Gabe!" Christian kept shouting, voice cracking on the last syllable. His camera bobbed at his chest until a root caught his boot and the strap went slack. The lens clipped a rock and Christian's hands opened like a fist in water. The camera skittered. Glass striking concrete with a high, awful chime. He lunged for it, fingers skimming its cold plastic, but a branch snagged his jacket, and something cold and patient grazed the back of his calf. He let the camera go. It spun, its display flashing one final, terrified blue before darkness swallowed it. "Leave it," Gabe snapped, voice low and sharp, and his focus steadied the rest of us. He pushed through a curtain of sap-laden leaves, torch bobbing ahead. His eyes were fixed on the tree line, not on the scattered gear behind us. Terry was almost paralyzed with the memory of those twin laughs, his face a pale oval. Matthew's breaths came in fast hiccups that took his words hostage. He clutched his chest, and his knuckles were white, as if he could squeeze air into being. We cut across the cracked pavement toward the camp, a planned route that should have meant safety but felt more like a funnel. Shadows lengthened, and the sky shut down in stages, first blue to bruised purple, then to the thin black of pending night. Something moved between two trees a dozen yards off, a silhouette, and for a beat I thought it was just one of the overgrown deer that had been making the outskirts their home. Then it straightened. It was wrong in the seams. Too tall, like the trunks had been lengthened while we weren't looking. Its hips and shoulders were misaligned, the torso a crooked column. Antlers jutted from its crown, but they were not the graceful branching of a stag. They were jagged geometry, branch-like, but with angles that made my eyes protest. When it shifted, its limbs didn't quite match human anatomy. One forearm seemed to slide a hair's breadth too fast, a joint where a joint should not be. It filled the space between trees like a nightmare of lampposts and bones. Jesus, Matthew breathed, and the sound was a rasp. The mimic had stopped copying voices and started copying form. The antler outline caught the last rays of light, throwing black prongs across the pavement in a pattern that made my stomach drop. We sprinted the last stretch. Packs and a tripod we had abandoned during earlier shots lay where we'd left them, strewn like excuses behind us. A light stand toppled, smacking concrete. A headlamp spun, casting a single frantic arc. The radios were left blaring static on the ground, an ugly chorus of interference. Christian tried to grab his fallen camera again and cursed when the strap tore and slid through his fingers. He abandoned it a second time and ran, jaw set, tears in the corners of his eyes. At the campsite, the largest tent loomed, a sagging fortress of canvas and poles. We dove for the zipper like drowning people for a ladder. The zipper snarled. The metal teeth caught and released, a mechanical hiccup that felt obscene in the quiet. Gabe yanked. The slider fought back like a mouth refusing to speak. Terry fumbled with a flashlight, shoving the beam into the teeth until the zipper grudgingly gave way another inch. Matthew's breaths were high and thin, his hand trembling against the tent as if he could hold reality together by pressing palm to fabric. We tumbled inside, stumbling over one another, slamming the fabric shut behind us. The zipper stuck halfway like a throat caught on a name. Hands slapped at the slider, fingers working with impatient, clumsy force. I shoved a cooler into the flap. Gabe drove a collapsed chair against the entrance. Christian pushed a camera bag and a broken tripod across the seam. The canvas creaked. The last inch of zipper stuttered and then forced itself past the snag with a small, grating finality. We piled gear across the doorway, stacked coolers and chairs, and a lantern between our legs, breathed on each other like a single panicked animal, and hoped the pile would be enough. All at once the tent felt too small, the air too warm and too loud, with our own heartbeat. And then the scratching started. The scratching became a rhythm, patient and deliberate, as if something was testing the canvas, one careful fingernail at a time. Then the fabric bulged once, twice, an oval swelling that ran like a slow heartbeat around the tent, flattening and puffing as whatever was outside traced the seams. It wasn't the tentative press of a hand. The canvas rippled in unnatural ways like something with too many joints sliding beneath a sheet. Shadows moved beneath the bulge, circles of darkness that sharpened and softened as they passed. And the zipper seam shuddered under a wave of pressure. Matthew sat cross-legged near the makeshift barricade, rocking gently, eyes unfocused. He held his knees like a child, holding a life preserver. He made no sound. Terry tried to laugh something loose, a bad, brave rasp that started as a joke and ended half a sob. "Okay," he said, forcing brightness into his voice. "If the thing wants snacks, we only have jerky and dignity." He coughed, handed a dying headlamp to Christian, like a peace offering. His smile cracked when no one laughed. At exactly 2 a.m., When the nearest clock had gone soft, with static, and the radio hummed white noise like a sleeping animal, the voice came. It spoke from right outside the fabric, muffled but unmistakably him. "Let me in," it said in Christian's voice. Tenor pitched thin with panic, syllables dragged like they'd been walked through gravel. "Please, it's cold. Let me in." The words were too precise, too memorized. Christian's real voice in the tent choked into a hoarse, animal sound. Everyone froze like someone had stopped time and left them inside a snow globe. Terry swallowed and tried another joke, flinching when his own breath cracked. "Christian, if you come in here, you owe me that camera back," he said, thin and brittle, and then he laughed without humor. Christian's hand clawed at the fabric as if he could peel the sound away. Matthew continued to rock. It was like the sight of sunlight on water to him. Movement soothed the panic into a manageable ache. The headlamp's battery was a currency now. Both flashlights flickered. One long, thin beam from Gabe, a scissor spark from Terry's dying lamp. They passed the single spare AA like a sacrament, balancing the light between Christian and Gabe so one could watch the zipper, while the other kept an eye on the seams. Light kept the bulges honest, but battery life kept running out. Each swap of the cell was an intimate ceremony, fingers brushing, whispered numbers for how many minutes left, a shared prayer that the tiny glow would hold. Gabe counted in even, calm tones, making a plan out of a heartbeat. "We hold until 4:15, he said. "We ration the battery so we always have 20 seconds of light on the seam every 5 minutes. At 20 minutes to dawn, we move, 2 at a time, clockwise, sprint to the cars. Count with me." He set the countdown like a metronome. It made the night feel less like an ocean and more like a measured corridor. Outside, the pleas became a chorus, one voice slipping into another, 1 second Christian, the next Matthew, then something deeper and unfamiliar. The fabric distorted to form mouths and eyes that weren't there. Each mimic tried a new inflection, a new memory. "You promised. Don't leave me. I need the camera." Phrases stolen, broken, used like keys in a lock they did not understand. Terry began to hum under his breath, a ridiculous nursery tune, and Matthew's rocking slowed, almost imperceptibly. The tent smelled like sweat and fear, the air thick with the copper tang of adrenaline. At 4:02, a faint smear of light painted the eastern seam. For a moment, everyone forgot to breathe. It looked like dawn, thin, hopeful, the exact color of mornings when the world could be trusted. But Gabe did not move. He watched as the smear drifted and wavered, as if someone outside held a flashlight low and then raised it. The hope felt false and sudden, like someone lifting a promise and letting it fall away. Terry whispered a prayer, and then started to sob without sound. When the smear steadied into a strip, and the voices outside shifted back to pleading, not mimicking, but calling names, Gabe drew them close, climbing over the pile of cold gear to kneel between them. He leaned forward so his breath dusted Christian's ear and said just loud enough for the 4 of them, "At first light we run for the cars," he whispered, laying out the rhythm of motion and who covered whom. His plan was a quiet map of timing and trust, a countdown he believed in because he had to. "At first light we run for the cars. At first light we run for the cars, Gabe said again, turning the sentence into a metronome. 1, 2, 3. Breathe on the third. He made their exits into a rhythm. Gabe watches the tent slit. Terry covers the left. Christian bolts for the path. Matthew takes point and leads them south. Count like a metronome. It made the night feel less like an ocean and more like a measured corridor. He could see the pale seam of dawn through the nylon. And for the first time since they'd crawled into the sleeping bags, hope felt like something you could touch. They moved like bad actors reciting a rehearsed line. Terry's hands trembled so hard he almost dropped the headlamp when Gabe instructed him to snap it off after 3. Christian didn't meet anyone's eyes. His jaw worked like a man chewing glass. Matthew's sleeping bag lay hollow and cold where he'd been. Gone. A second whisper from outside answered Gabe's breathing exercise with Matthew's name, soft and exactly right. "Matthew," Terry hissed. His voice cracked. The syllable became a plea. Gabe's mouth went dry. The voice outside matched the cadence of the name. Too perfect. Threaded with a memory only a friend could know. They unzipped and tumbled into the pre-dawn air with the stiffness of people who have practiced not panicking. Coordination failed in the first 30 seconds. Terry lagged, fingers fumbling with a pack strap. Christian took 2 steps and stopped to listen, then took 2 more in the wrong direction. Gabe barked the count, and it broke into something ragged. 3. Run. Now. He pushed Terry, grabbed Christian's shoulder, and shoved them both toward the tree line. "Matt, you coming?" Terry yelled. The answer back was a single slow footstep, then another, like someone dragging a puppet. It was Matthew's voice, but the rhythm was wrong. It twitched against the syllables. At first it was left, right, left, the gait of a man with a limp. Then jerk, lurch, shimmy, Matthew's body walking as if puppeted by a hand with arthritis. The movements were jerky, a series of stops and starts that did not match the voice. His arms swung not with momentum, but with tiny seizures. His head tilted too far to the side, then snapped back, as if bearing 1,000 small, wrong balances. "Matt, stop!" Gabe called, and the voice answered, but it split, stuttered, echoed. I need the camera," it said, vowels slipping into animal sounds. A brief human laugh bled into a wet chewing noise. Another voice threaded through. Christian's old laugh from sophomore year. Someone else's reprimand. The high-pitched prattle of a child. The mimic was experimenting, twisting memory into testing tools of trust. Then the face unmade itself. At first it was a tiny wrongness, an eye that sat a millimeter too low, a smile that oozed past the cheekbone. Matthew's mouth opened, and the skin above it pulled like wax. Gabe saw the cheekbone underneath like a map, then the surface of his friend's face ripple and fold, as if it were a mask being peeled. Flesh sagged and reconfigured. The likeness slumped into something that remembered Matthew only in pieces. Teeth appeared where lids should be. Eyes multiplied and slid along tendons that were not eyes. Where a nose had been, there was a slick slit that breathed in and out like bellows. The sound it made when the mask came off was not a scream. It was a wet, peeling note, a sound that scraped the inside of Gabe's teeth. The mimic dropped mimicry entirely. The voice that had once been Matthew became a guttural scaffolding of stolen sounds. "Don't leave me," it rasped, each word a different throat. The creature's head snapped toward the tent, not with curiosity but with the patient hunger of one that had solved a complex lock and finally found the door ajar. Gabe lunged. He saw the creature's smile too late and felt its weight as he collided with what had been Matthew. Bodies hit the ground with a sprawl of canvas and gear. Gabe wrapped an arm around the thing's neck and squeezed, feeling something that was not muscle but layered, wrong musculature sliding under his palm. It reeked of copper and mold and a metallic tang that vibrated inside his mouth. Terry cried out behind them, and somewhere a branch cracked, a noise like a gunshot. Gabe's tackle stopped the creature from taking another step toward the trees, but it kicked, thrashing with sudden speed. It twisted like a snake and shed sections of outer skin that came away like wet rags. Gabe felt hot blood on his forearm, where a hidden tooth had grazed him. He tasted iron. He pinned the thing enough to roll, to push them both downhill. And then it was a scramble. The forest around them became a blur of roots and low boughs. Christian broke into a run, then skidded where the earth gave way. The chase became a spill toward the ravine, a dark throat in the land. The ground sloped. Gabe could hear the mimic's lubrication from behind him, deep, sucking sounds. Then its cry of something that could have been Matthew's voice, insected, pleading, angry. They hit the slick edge, and Christian's sneaker found nothing. He stumbled, one knee buckling over moss, hands scrabbling for grip. Gabe grabbed him, hauling shoulder and shirt with a curse, and for a breathless instant Christian hung there, half on the path, half in the dark. The creature lunged from the slope, its body a series of wrong angles, limbs rearranging like spilled cutlery trying to find function. Gabe planted both feet on a rock, shoved, and the thing missed Christian by inches. It clawed at the ledge. Toenails that were teeth or teeth that were nails scored the stone. Christian screamed as the thing scraped and slipped, then clawed again, and this time something gave. The mimic's hand skidded on the rock and left a smear that was not just earth. Dark, bright, undeniable blood painted the stone where the creature's claws had found purchase. They tumbled onto the outcrop, breath ripping, lungs burning, hearts like hammers. Gabe's shoulder screamed where something had nicked a tendon. Blood soaked through the sleeve and dotted the rock where his palm lay. Terry collapsed into a shuddering, heaving mess that laughed and cried at once. Christian sat very still, staring at his shaking hands as if seeing them for the first time. Gabe drew his knees up and pressed his back to the cold stone, eyelids blistering with sweat. Behind them, down in the valley, the creature scraped at the rim. Its noises had reverted to mimicry in a brittle, taunting chorus. Matthew's voice, then Christian's, then Terry's. Each phrase frayed to extremity. For now it could not climb. For now they were on a rocky outcrop, ringed by drops and the thin promise of dawn streaking the sky. They were alive. The blood on the rocks was drying into a streak that looked like a map of wrong things. They sat there and listened, counting breaths like a metronome. waiting to see whether dawn would keep its promise. They sat there and listened, counting breaths like a metronome, waiting to see whether dawn would keep its promise. The tree line answered instead, a dozen half-voices folding into one another until names leaked out like bait. Matt, Chris, Terry, each syllable wore the shape of someone they'd loved. Each ended in the wrong pitch, the wrong sorrow. Echoes braided through the briar, stealing direction, settling in the places a person would step if they thought a friend was calling from ahead. Christian dug his nails into the rock as the chorus began again. Terry clutched at his knees and made a sound that was part sob and part prayer. The watch on Gabe's wrist chimed once, thin and clinical, then began to count down in a small, glowing rectangle. 001459. The numbers fell with a cruel insistence. The sound was so mundane it might have been a tease, a timer, someone setting a deadline for a nightmare. "Don't move," Gabe said. He sounded exhausted, too quiet at first, then harder when Christian's hands began to shake faster than the night. The voices threaded closer, imitating laughter, imitating his own voice saying, "Come on, come find me." They left gaps like snares, words that stopped abruptly, so your mind would step into them. Christian's throat worked. He mouthed their names back to the dark as if speaking could pin the sounds down. Terry kept murmuring into his palms, syllables dissolving into hiccuped sobs. The mimic worked like a surgeon, pruning roots. When Christian took an involuntary step toward a familiar voice, the tree line answered from another angle, and a branch slapped across his face as if the woods itself had hands. 01243. The watch glared. A new sound crawled up from the slope, wet, close, like a mouth adjusting to a stolen bite. It wasn't a bark or a growl. It was a wet snarl, the kind of animal noise that told you teeth were clearing things that weren't meant to be cleared. It smelled of old rain and iron. The creature tested the edge with a fingertip, nails rasping the stone in a rhythm that matched the digits on Gabe's watch. Gabe's face went flat. There was something like resignation there, like a man pulling on a coat he had not planned to wear. He shoved himself upright, palms leaving red smears. "Run!" he shouted, voice cracking the air. He didn't scream for them to go. He ordered it. "Run straight for 15 minutes. The command hit like a bell. Christian and Terry took one terrible, perfect step, then another. Thorns reached with greedy spokes, snagging hair and shirt, spitting skin. The briar tore at them, as if aware they were trying to escape a story it had helped write. Terry's sobs turned into the ragged, fueled breaths of someone sprinting on fumes. Christian felt each thorn like a tally mark, each seam in his shoe a countdown. Behind them the mimic lunged. Gabe threw himself at the thing as if physics were loyalty. He hit it with a sound that was half a prayer and half a shout, grappling with limbs that folded wrong, palms finding places that were not human, and holding anyway. The creature answered with that wet snarl, and the ledge became a tangle of flailing and curse-slick skin and the smell of crushed earth. 000906. The numbers kept falling. They ran, boots slapping, breath tasting of iron, the watch's glow of vanishing promise on Gabe's wrist as he fought on the lip of the world. The last thing I saw as we barreled down the slope and through the thorn fence was Gabe, his shirt ragged, one arm swallowed by the dark, his mouth open in a sound I will never be able to unhear, and then hands, wrong-angled, hauling him into darkness as we fled. Dawn is a lie that morning, the light soft and clean, as if it has never watched anyone bleed. We climbed out of the briar like animals ejected from a den, clothes shredded, skin a map of white scratches and fresh red. My calves still hammered with the memory of flight. My hands trembled and felt foreign. Christian's jacket hung off one shoulder, his mouth a hard line. Terry walked like he was being pulled by rope tied through his sternum, eyes empty and stupid and terrible. We found the logging road because the forest spat us out. It was 4 ruts and dirt and a thin ribbon of frost that made the world look polite. A truck came along, a ranger's rig, dented, the kind of truck that smells of diesel and dust and government boredom. It slowed. The driver rolled down his window and looked at us as if we were a roadside accident someone else had already called about. "You boys okay?" he asked, the doubt in his voice a physical thing. He scanned us. The cuts, the dirt caked under our nails, the stain on my sleeve. "You lost?" Christian stepped forward like a man stepping onto familiar ground. Car trouble," he said, voice flat and fast, already assembling a story that would fit into a notebook. "Broke down up the ridge. Trail snares. Had to hike out." The ranger's eyebrows climbed. "At dawn? Where's your car?" Terry blinked slowly. His lips parted. A small laugh leaked out and died. "Gone," he said, vacant, like replying to a question about the weather. The ranger's mouth pressed into a line. "Did you see anything? Animals? People?" My voice came out as if through cotton. I wanted to say it wasn't animals, that it had hands like human hands, and made sounds like the inside of a throat being wound down. I wanted to say Gabe. Christian's hand found my wrist and squeezed, a dry, practical clamp. He answered for me. "Nocturnal thing. Noise." We ran. The ranger looked at us long enough for a verdict to grow in his face. "You boys need to report this at the station. Can't have folk wandering around the reserve like that." He advised, sympathetic and skeptical in equal measure. He radioed, tossed us water bottles, told us to come in. We climbed into the cab like admitting guilt. At the station, the fluorescent light made everything flatter and truer. The air smelled of paper, bleach, and something else. Old coffee. A machine clicked and coughed in the corner, coffee filling the room with the ordinary soundtrack of waiting. Drip, hiss, the soft clack of porcelain on plastic. A man at the desk asked for our statements. Pens squeaked. Forms multiplied. Christian sat up straight and spoke like he was editing live. He crossed out phrases with the same calm that had guided us through packing, through silence in the dark. "We were hiking," he told the officer, then softened it, then erased another detail. He cut the impossible out of our story with the precision of a butcher. "We don't want to involve anyone in speculation," he said. "No weird details, just facts." His voice made it in order, though it was for us. Terry filled a plastic cup with coffee and stared at the steam as if it might show him something he could recognize. "Gabe," he murmured, then didn't finish the sentence. He watched the cup, vacant, lips twitching, as if the words were trying to crawl back into his throat. The officer repeated our sanitized version into a recorder, the red light marking time. We watched ourselves become less monstrous, less unbelievable on paper. The station hummed, the copier, the clack of keys, the coffee machine's steady sigh, each ordinary noise a small anchor. By the window, my reflection was a smear. Teeth and tired shadows, and a face that couldn't quite hold the memory of what it had seen. In the glass, the fluorescent rose bent and stretched the yard outside. Something brushed past the lot, a shape that reorganized the light into antlered silhouettes. For a second, the reflection turned the square of the window into a forest, and antlers reached into the room like questions. I blinked, and the shadow moved with the bend of the glass, long and patient. Christian's hand tightened on the story he wanted us to tell, and I felt the lie settle like a bandage. The antler shadows slid across the pane, as if they could read the words we kept. We were unraveled in different rooms of the same small hospital. Christian in a chair with stacks of legal pads on the floor, Terry in a locked wing, the nurses called the quiet unit, and me in the hallway that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, listening to the fluorescent lights buzz like insects. Terry's hands were folded over his blanket when I first saw him. They were thinner than I remembered, knuckles like small white hills. He watched the ceiling as if it were the ocean, and the plaster were waves he could count. When I said his name, he blinked, slow and mechanical, and mouthed, "Gabe," as if the T had scraped the inside of his mouth. He did not talk beyond that. He answered the nurse's questions with nods that arrived a beat late, as if the words had to be assembled in a factory behind his eyes. Sometimes he'd laugh, a little hiccup that didn't match anything else in the room. Once he pressed the heel of his hand to his temple and whispered, "They were in the trees," like a confession or a benediction. A nurse held my shoulder as I left. I could hear the walls humming my name. Christian became a permanent fixture in the municipal library's basement, where the air tasted of dust and carbon copies. He lived in microfilm rooms and stacks of brittle newspapers with names and dates typed in ink that had faded to blue-gray. He treated the past like a nervous patient. Gentle questions, repeated tests, 100 small prods to see what it would reveal. He read, and he wrote notes in margins. That same hard-edged calm I'd seen at the police station when he cut weird details from our statement. He drew lines between columns of print with a ruler, made charts on scrap paper, cross-referenced search party logs against weather reports. He would sit back, rub his eyes, and recite findings like someone rehearsing scripture. 3 disappearances clustered on the 4th of July, 2002, he'd say. 4 near the quarry, northwest quadrant. Search party logs show repeated grid failures. He said grid failures like it was a medical term. The search party records were worse in person. Thin binders, dog-eared pages, the same smudged handwriting repeated. Names of volunteers, times they left, times they came back. There were entries like area cleared, followed by sightings unconfirmed, and an awkward column labeled returned items, where someone had scrawled camcorder found, mute. One report had a photograph stapled into it, a black smudged print of 3 men on a ridge. In the corner, someone had written, "Last seen together." None of the reports mentioned a body that could be cataloged, placed in a drawer, and checked off. Gabe's name appeared in witness lists, in phone logs, in a note about a jacket left behind on a rock. But in the mortuary ledgers, there was no file, no number, no box label. The absence sat like a burned-out tooth. I started going through old newspapers because Christian wouldn't stop sending me clippings at all hours. He'd slip them under my front door at night like ominous mail. Headlines with the same jagged urgency. Photographs of families posed in front of houses with faces that looked like they were holding their breath. He drew chalk circles around paragraphs where a search was called off because hazardous conditions persisted where a volunteer failed to return to the staging area. He printed maps and pinned them to his apartment wall, connecting towns and dates with red thread. He stopped sleeping more often than before. Sometimes he would say, without looking at me, "Patterns are signals. People see them when they're hungry. We're hungry." And then he'd laugh like someone pleased he'd found the answer to a riddle that only he could hear. My nights were worse than any research. Matthew's voice kept finding me in the dark. Not Matthew as a man, but as a frequency that bent the air around my skull. It would slip into the dream like a radio on the wrong station, pitched wrong and slow as if heard underwater. "Stay," it would call, and the vowels would unwind like taffy. Once it sounded as if someone had put his mouth next to a metal pipe. Another time, it was thin and split, 2 voices braided. I'd wake with my throat raw, as if I'd been screaming, and the sound had been pulled from me by suction. There were nights when the voice said my name, and the window panes hummed with the same harmony. The dreams always ended the same way. I would be running through a black thicket, my clothes snagging on brambles that felt like fingers, and the voice would fold into a laugh that wasn't his, a child's imitation of thunder. The smell of wet pine followed me into the daylight. We kept thinking a record would resolve everything, that missing pieces could just be found and put back together, that Terry's silence could be filled with facts. The county files, cross-referenced with Christian's work, proved otherwise. There were holes in the official timelines where search parties should have logged returns. There were gaps where a body should have been processed. In the end, the ledger clerk shook his head and said, "No record of recovery," in a voice like he was delivering bad weather. Christian stared at that phrase until his eyes watered. "Never recovered," he breathed, then circled the words in pen as if circling would trap them. Months bled into a year of small torments. Terry's visits grew less frequent as hospital policy tightened. Family had to be cleared. Forms signed, proof produced. There was a day the nurse handed me a letter from Terry. It was 3 lines, written in a careful child hand. "I hear it at night. It is patient. Do not go into the dark." He had pressed the pen so hard the paper bled through. I folded it into my palm like a relic. Then came the posters. New ones, glossy and current, stapled to telephone poles, in grid-perfect rectangles. Faces smiling from summer photos with the wedges of sunlight cut from them. Names. Dates. Missing since October printed in stark black. They multiplied in neighborhoods we had driven through a dozen times. They appeared across social media feeds labeled, "Have you seen this person?" Christian collected them too, photographed each one, annotated them with GPS coordinates and timestamps. The missing were no longer a story from the past. They were right now. The last straw was a message thread that popped up on my phone, a link to a local subreddit, a clip of a person filming at night in an abandoned quarry, a figure at the edge of the frame that moved wrong. Comments cascaded beneath it. Creepy, fake, where is this? And then a line. 2 people gone from this neighborhood tonight. The notifications came like small alarm bells, new disappearances, same geometry. We had rehearsed silence so carefully that it had calcified into guilt. We had told the officers what could be believed. We had told the hospitals what could be tolerated. The pattern had taken that lie and made it a shape that swallowed others. Christian stared at the newest poster on his wall and said, without the practiced calm, "We've been cataloging with a scalpel when what we need is a microphone." He looked at me the way I'd seen him look when he was about to cross out a paragraph and write an entire new one. Either the pattern grows or it ends because people start talking. I sat up because talking had become an action I could measure. I dusted the microphone, tuned it like a violin. The room smelled faintly of solder and coffee. The little red recording light blinked, patient and hungry. I sat down, hands jittering against the stand, and felt the weight of everything that had been unsaid, like pebbles in my mouth. Outside the window, a car passed, and its headlights carved a temporary day into the dark. The posters on the bulletin board shifted in the street lamp breeze. My thumb hovered over the recorder's button. Christian's eyes were on me like a promise. Terry, if he could ever know, was somewhere behind a locked door, counting waves on a plaster ceiling. I leaned forward, felt the metal cool against my lips, and took a long, deliberate breath into the microphone. I saw him before I understood what seeing meant. A shape at a corner table, steam from his mug, lifting like a ghost between us, a thin veil that made his face both nearer and impossible to reach. The cafe hummed with small lives, the hiss of milk, the scrape of a chair, a radio buried in the back announcing a traffic delay, and between a commercial for a dentist and a jazz standard, a bulletin. 2 people reported missing from the Maplewood neighborhood. The words landed like cold coins in my lap. He wore the same jacket I'd memorized 7 years ago. Faded denim, a tear at the cuff, a cigarette burn like a punctuation mark near the hem. Unchanged clothing, as if he'd stepped out of a photograph that had been left too long in the sun. The scar along his jaw cut the light wrong. The skin there looked like an old map. Up close, his eyes were wrong. Not the milky brown I had cataloged in my head, but a flat, unnerving gray, a color that matched the sky on nights when storms begin as whispers. For a second, my brain tried to correct the file. Same scars, wrong eye color. That gap was a live wire. He looked up. He didn't move toward me or away. He simply acknowledged my presence with the practiced pause someone gives when they spot an old acquaintance in a crowd, only there was no warmth in it. His smile was a small thing, a tightening along the mouth, predatory by the measure of his stillness. The steam curled between us like a hand, and for a moment it felt as if it existed to show the distance. No words passed. We had always rehearsed silence until it calcified. Now, silence sat between us like a witness. People passed in and out of my peripheral vision, a barista calling out names, a student tapping on a laptop. The broadcast on the radio threaded back into my attention, a reporter listing the missing, the neighborhoods, the time they were last seen. New names, new geometry. The pattern had learned to repeat itself in staircases of disappearance. My throat felt raw. My fingers found the recorder in my pocket like muscle memory. I pressed it out of habit first, a tiny soft click that sounded too loud for the quiet inside me. The red light blinked, patient and accusing. I didn't want to speak. Not yet. I wanted to see whether this thing, this man who was and wasn't the man I knew, would break the shape by moving. He did not move. He watched me the way a predator watches for the scent that tells a thing is wounded. When he finally leaned forward, it was barely perceptible, the sort of motion that adapts to silence rather than violates it. His voice, when it came, was smaller than I expected, a breath against the hum of the cafe. "You're not Matthew." The words were an insect on glass. They fit into the space between my ribs and thudded there. I opened my mouth, but whatever answer curled there sank back into the hollow. When I blinked, he was gone. No chair scraped, no cup clattered. The seat across from him held only a smear of steam, slowly dissolving into the air. I turned automatically to the window, to the line of trees that framed the lot behind the cafe. The woods looked the same as the ones around the quarry, patient, dark, as if they kept time differently than the city. For an instant I imagined him there, at the edge of the pines,